Hi, I'm Ron Timehin. It's good to be back on the channel. Right now, we are in Iceland. More specifically, we're in Reykjavik. And in this video, we're going to be showing you how to take the best possible photos of Iceland. Let's go. For our first location, we are at this amazing church found in the heart of Reykjavik. Now, I know it's an architectural photograph, but we will be shooting a lot of landscapes later on in this video. So I thought we'll stop by and I'll teach you how to get a really nice shot of this amazing building. One of the most popular compositions for capturing this building is to get a perfectly symmetrical shot. Now, you might wonder, how do you get a perfectly symmetrical shot? Well, I'm going to show you now. Tip number one, have a look at the ground. There are often indicators on the ground that will tell you whether you're perfectly symmetrical or not. So in this instance, if you have a look at the floor here, you can see that the markings on the floor line up right down the middle of the church, and that gives you an indication as to where to stand. Now, once you've established where to stand, you can also use your camera's grid lines to help you capture a perfectly symmetrical photo. Now, I like to use the rule of thirds, and when you have the lines perfectly straight and the subject is in the middle of those lines, then you know that your camera is also in the right position. The lens that I'm using to capture this piece of architecture is a 14mm f1.8. I'm going super wide on this because it is a very tall building and I want to capture the entirety of it. So I'd recommend, if you are coming here to photograph this building, use maybe a 14 or a 16mm lens, and that will give you the most flexibility when capturing this piece of architecture. One thing you always want to do as a photographer is pay attention to light. Now, we are shooting Iceland in the winter, which means the sun rises behind this building here. Now, that also means that you'll be shooting mainly into the shadow if you want to get that hero shot. There are a number of different ways you can get around this to get a very nicely exposed photo. One method is to use a HDR method, and that means taking multiple exposures of the same scene. You expose one shot for the highlights, you expose another one, which is the middle, and then you take another one which is exposed for the shadows. And then in post, you can merge them all together and you'll get a very evenly balanced image. Something else you can do is to move around the scene and work out where the light is falling. Now, we decided to go inside the church and it was absolutely incredible. We had the sun rising behind and shining through the windows, which created this really lovely glow inside the church. One thing to note here as well is that you are allowed to film and you are allowed to take photos inside the church, but always be respectful. Whilst I was inside, I had my camera on silent mode, and that was to make sure that I didn't disturb anybody who was worshipping and any of the choir that was singing. Right now, we are at the glaciers, and this is another very popular location in Iceland. It's a really cool spot. The water is boiling temperature and then it spouts into the sky, and you can get some really cool photos. But I wanted to talk about some top tips for shooting Iceland and planning your stay here. One thing you want to do before embarking on your journey to Iceland is your research. Now, a lot of the very popular locations here are spread quite far apart from each other. So you want to have a look at a map and work out how many locations you can target in a day. Now, you also want to be flexible because the weather here is very dynamic and it shifts a lot. So you always want to make sure that you're prepared for that and you have a backup plan just in case the weather isn't in your favor. Now, that leads me on to transport. So again, as I said, a lot of the locations are spread far apart and you're going to need to be able to get from one location to another. I think there are three options here. Option number one is that you go on guided tours. Now, there are so many guided tours available here that visit lots of different locations. The thing about the tours are that you don't have much time to spend at each location and you don't really have much flexibility if the weather is poor. The second option is to use taxis. Now, taxis are great because they're a bit more flexible. You can spend as long as you want at each location, and you can also choose the order of the locations that you visit. But this does come at a cost, and a steep one at that. So just be prepared. It might not be the most economically viable option for some of you out there. The third option is to rent a car. That's probably the most favorable option. It's not as expensive as hiring taxis. However, you must be a confident driver when you're driving in icy or dangerous conditions. Great, now we've got that covered. Let's talk about clothing. Iceland is extremely cold, especially in the winter, but even in the summer, it can get to quite low temperatures. So I would definitely advise layering up. Right now, I'm wearing 4 layers and a jacket, and that's keeping me very warm. Hats, gloves, face masks are also great accessories to help you stay warm. That can make the difference between staying out and getting the best light or going home early because you're too cold. Now that's covered, let's talk about equipment. Let's start with camera bodies. Now I'm using the Sony A7R Mark V, and this is a workhorse. It has a very high resolution sensor, so you can shoot landscapes in great detail, and it also gives you flexibility if you do need to crop in your images. The next camera body that I brought with me is the Sony A7S III, and yes, although this is primarily a video camera, it has great sensitivity when it comes to ISO. So if you are looking to shoot stars or the northern lights, then this camera is really going to help you in those low light situations. Wicked. Let's talk about lenses. The first lens that I am going to show you is the 16 to 35mm f2.8, and this lens is a fantastic wide angle lens. It will help you get those incredible wide shots when you're in tight situations, and you can capture lots in within the scene. The second lens is the 24 to 70 f2.8, and again, this is such a versatile lens, and I think this will help you out in any situation. So if you do want to zoom in and get some tighter details of your scene, then this is definitely the lens for you. The third lens I'm going to show you is the Sony 14mm f1.8, and this lens is primarily used for astro or northern light photography. Reason being, it's a very wide lens, which means you can capture lots of detail in the sky, and the aperture goes down to f1.8, which means it will be great in low light situations. The final lens that I brought with me is the 70 to 200 f2.8, and I absolutely love this lens. I think it's fantastic for landscape photography as well. It allows you to really punch in and capture some details in your scene, and it also allows you to isolate subjects. So if you are shooting things like animals, then this will definitely help you do that. Let's talk about accessories. My first accessory that I recommend everyone bring is an ND filter. ND filters are fantastic for when you want to get long exposure photography done during the daytime. Another accessory I highly recommend every photographer to bring to Iceland is a tripod. Now, tripods keep your camera perfectly still, and that's very useful when you're doing long exposures or HDR or exposure blending images. Another accessory that is very well suited for Iceland is a drone. Drones allow you to get up in the sky, get an elevated view, and capture some really dynamic photos. One thing to note is just make sure when you are at locations, you check the rules on whether you are allowed to fly there or not. I found that most places are quite welcoming of drones, but just be careful. If you are in places like national parks, then they are banned. So just make sure you do your research before you fly and be safe. We're at our next location, and it's a very famous waterfall here in Iceland called Skógafoss. Now, Skógafoss is one of the bigger waterfalls that you'll find, and that can often prove to be a little bit tricky to capture. So I'm going to give you some top tips now on how to capture Skógafoss in the best possible way. I'm interested in making the water in a scene silky smooth, so how do we do that? Well, first we're going to need a tripod. The tripod is important because we need to keep our camera perfectly still, as we'll be using a very slow shutter speed. Now, when you use a slow shutter speed during the day, you'll often overexpose your photo. So to minimize the light going into your sensor, we're going to use an ND filter. An ND filter is something that attaches to the front of your lens. You saw it in the What's in My Bag section of this video. The ND that I'm using is a variable ND made by Timehin, and I find it really useful because I'm able to dial it in and play around and find that perfect exposure. Now that I've attached the variable ND to my lens, I'm able to slow my shutter speed down to 5 seconds, which then allows me to get that silky smooth water effect. Let's talk a little bit about f-stop. Now, my f-stop is set at f22, and this is for 2 reasons. Number 1, I want to make sure that everything in the scene behind me is sharp, so that you can see the little details and the intricacies within the scene. And reason number 2, because there is so much light in the scene and we're trying to get a slow shutter effect, I need to make sure that my aperture is small. That's going to stop a lot of light getting onto the sensor and help us get a very well balanced exposure. A pro tip for getting perfectly still images when using a tripod is to set a 2-second timer. Now, you might think, why is this necessary? Well, when you press the shutter button, that motion in itself causes the camera to shake a little bit. And so if you set a 2-second timer, that will eliminate any camera shake caused by pressing the shutter button. The last thing we haven't spoken about yet is ISO. Now, I like to use the lowest ISO possible when shooting landscapes, and this just allows for a cleaner image and it gives you maximum flexibility when it comes to post-processing. So for this scene here, I have my setting at ISO 100, and that's going to make sure that all of the detail is clear and I'm able to edit it further in post. Right, so behind me we have one of the most popular photo locations in Iceland, and you can see it's an amazing abandoned plane here. Now, a lot of photographers come here. My recommendation would be that you arrive early. That way you can get the best light, you can beat the crowd, and also you can have a bit more freedom to experiment and play. So let's jump into it. I'm going to show you some compositional tips that will help you take some great photos of this location. Now, here are some top compositional tips for you to get some great photos of this location. Tip number 1, use the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds are your best friend. You can add them onto your screen on your camera, and this will give you a rough guide as to where to place the subject. Now, I like to place the subject on either the lower third or the top third of your rule of thirds, and you can also play around with putting the horizon on one of those lines too. And that way you'll get a little bit more of an interesting photo than just placing it bang on in the middle. Tip number 2, play around with scale. You can't really tell how big this plane is unless you have something in the scene that you are familiar with, like a person. So maybe add a person to the scene, and then that way you give your viewers a bit more context as to how big the subject is. Tip number 3, play around with focal lengths. Now, I like to travel with a 24-70 and a 70-200, and these focal lengths give me a nice range to play around with. The 24-70 I like to use when I'm getting close to my subjects. It allows the viewer to feel like they are part of the scene. When I'm using the 70-200, I like to get back and shoot from a distance. And what this allows me to do is to compress the scene. What I mean by that is if you have elements in the background and elements in the foreground, it brings them all together in the frame. And that can create a really nice composition in your image. We're back in Reykjavik, and this is where our journey comes to an end. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the tips and tricks. And if you do come to Iceland and you use these tips and you want to share some photos, please hashtag WexHow2. We'd love to check them out. Anyway, that's me for now. I'll catch you all in the next video. Take care.